Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. Red Bull say that Yuki Tsunoda will see out the season with the team, but will Max Verstappen see out his contract with Red Bull Racing that currently runs until 2028? Helmut Marko with a bombshell today, suggesting there is a performance clause in Verstappen's contract that at the mid-season summer break, if the car isn't good enough, Max can simply say he's going to leave. Marko says that if Max goes, he will likely go as well. Could that be to Mercedes? Is Toto Wolff licking his lips right now with this prospect, as Marko has just put this into reality today? Very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy, subscribe if you're new as always. I would greatly appreciate loads of subs as well over the last few days. I massively appreciate you all, as you know. This is the white bull. Rumour is today that it could have actually been a pink bull. Kimmelman put a post out on his Instagram and said that it's going to be white. It's not exactly going to look like this, I don't imagine, but something relatively similar. And obviously this is, you know, the RB16B rather than the RB21 for this year, but it could have been like a cherry blossom livery or something. But it seems like they're going with a slightly more simple approach because of the weight on the car. One thing I wanted to get into before we start really here is on Ferrari, because it was obviously a disaster in China. They got the double disqualification. It surely can't get any worse than that, and they've got the new floor on the way in Bahrain. I think it's interesting that De Keyser here says, of course, De Keyser's, close with Ferrari in the Italian press, mentioning Vasseur being under some pressure. And I don't think Vasseur's really been under any pressure over the last couple of years at Ferrari, because after Bonotto, it was like, well, can't get any worse than this, right? But Vasseur comes in, seems like he's doing the job, makes some pretty cutthroat decisions at the time, and Aki Rueda, one of their strategy guys, is gone. But is their strategy much better than it previously was? Are their operations much better than they previously were? One could argue not necessarily. Hamilton has arrived to Ferrari and in the first two Grand Prix has had the full Ferrari experience. It doesn't seem like all that much has changed. At the end of the day, the buck stops with Vasseur. Adrian Newey was potentially going to go to Ferrari and come to Maranello. Maybe that's where he wanted to go, but he wanted more power, more control over the way that the team was run, technical vetoes in terms of staffing on his team, and Vasseur said, no, we cannot do that. I'd be giving up too much power. Maybe a sensible decision, but nonetheless, Newey has now walked away to Aston Martin, and Vasseur is left with a ship which needs to be steadied, to say the very least. Last year, they were really in the fight for the constructors. They eventually lost it. This year, if they're nowhere near, the pressure will seriously pile on, especially if the rumours are true. The next year, the Mercedes engine is going to be the dominant force, and Ferrari, again, may be struggling to put together a championship challenge, especially because the car this year, they took some risk, and look, it was inevitable that one of the teams that took risk, maybe many of the teams that took risk, would backfire on them to some degree. We said it with Mercedes, it didn't seem like they were taking too much risk, but equally they were therefore in position to capitalise when Ferrari, Red Bull seemingly have got it wrong. And maybe even McLaren could go too far with an upgrade and Mercedes all of a sudden find themselves in a really nice spot. But the SF25, there's a compromise, it seems, between getting the good rear instability, or getting good rear stability, not the instability, and the floor height, as in generating pure downforce and performance. They're struggling with that. If they run the car too low, okay, they get the performance, but they get the disqualification because the floor plank wears too much. That's a real issue for them to resolve. The gearbox, the suspension changes that they've made haven't really given them what they wanted. Ferrari know this. Ferrari have a new floor on the way for Bahrain. They'll hope that it will resolve these issues, but it's not 100% clear that it will. There's also a bit of drama on McLaren versus Mercedes, certainly involving Lando Norris. Now, rumour has it, the rear wing flexibility, the mini DRS effect that was clamped down on surprisingly in China after what we saw in Australia, affected about half of the teams. So apparently the rear wings in Australia, 4 or 5 of them were not compliant, including, I think it's Alpine, but certainly McLaren, at the following Grand Prix in China. So they had to make some tweaks. Lando Norris was very adamant in China that McLaren had nothing to change about their car. And maybe the rear wing didn't need changing, but the way that it was set up needed changing to deal with some of the issues they had. And that resulted in what we saw in China, which was a lower straight line speed than we might have expected from the McLaren. And maybe it's true that McLaren can maintain the great performance they have and the excellent tyre wear that they presently enjoy, but they may lose out in some straight line speed factors. And even if it's an extra, kilometre or 3 kph on a straight, that's enough of a difference to make a difference over the course of a Grand Prix and a stint in a qualifying session when the margins are very tight. So it doesn't feel like the McLarens are miles away, and equally some of these changes feel like they're going to peg McLaren back to some degree, so they might at least be gettable by some of the other teams at some point. Russell, after the first Grand Prix, was basically saying that they were not gettable and there was no way that anyone was going to be able to catch up to the McLarens this year. The same story as Red Bull 2023. Russell has, not backed down on these comments, but certainly Lando Norris has given his thoughts on it and says, what? A bigger advantage than 2023 Red Bull that won everything? Yeah, sure, right. I thought Russell was a bit smarter than that, but clearly not. I don't even need to say anything. I think it's obvious enough that it's not. George thinks he can play a lot of games, but I don't fall for any of them. The car is clearly not as strong as the Red Bull. It's very good, but the fact that he has been saying so much, oh, the season's over and all this after one race is a bit weird. He can do what he wants. I'm happy that he thinks those things. Going on to say that it seems like he's done with the season. It seems like I am in his head if he thinks that they can't catch up. So, strong words from Lando to George. I know that many will not 100% mesh with Norris's personality. He is a bit of a divisive figure, but I get it why he says these things, and I think there's a little bit of Zach Brown about Norris, and maybe this is true for many drivers and team principals, but when they get a winning car, all of a sudden they're talking crazy, right? Maybe it's justified. He's leading the championship, he's the current championship favourite, and if I had to put money on it, I'd say that he's probably going to win it, but still, he's talking a big game, isn't he, Lando? And basically saying, yeah, what's Russell talking about? I'm living in his head rent-free. I'm sure that Russell is hoping as a result of this, he is going to be in position to fight this guy for the championship this year because, that could get pretty spicy. But moving onwards, this is Yuki Tsunoda, and this is Helmut Marko in the centre of the screen saying that he will get the rest of the year at the team. But will Max Verstappen? That is the big question. What I did want to dive into, though, was an article that came out yesterday, which I thought was very interesting, discussing why Red Bull made this decision now. Because many thought, it was like Honda, and they were paying them the money. And Marko says, well, okay, sure, but that wasn't the primary motivation. It wasn't the motivation. Honda is happy with it, but their involvement ends at the end of the year anyway, so, no big deal. Apparently, though, Red Bull gave Tsunoda, after China, 2 or 3 simulator sessions to prove himself. Now, this is interesting because the rumour had it that Sunday night at the Grand Prix, there was talk around the paddock that Lawson was going to get axed. And, well, maybe they'd already kind of made the decision, but they wanted to see whether Yuki had what it takes. They put him in the simulator. He obviously drove the RB20 at the Abu Dhabi test last year, and he came out afterwards and said, yeah, great car. Like, I fit right in. I felt pretty comfortable in the machine and all this. And at the time, we were saying, well, is he just saying that, right? Like, to make it so that they put him in the car? And maybe. But it feels like when they actually said, all right, Yuki, let's see what you got. Put you in the sim, drive the RB21, and seemingly he delivered. Red Bull was super impressed, and they decided, yeah, we're going to stick him in the car. We had to act quickly, and everything was positive. Also, the technical feedback, which he had often been accused of lacking, which I find hilarious because isn't it you guys that have been saying for years that he's been lacking it? Not for years, exactly. But you know what I'm saying, right? It's often Red Bull that are making these points on like, oh yeah, well, Yuki, he lacks in experience, he lacks in expertise on the technical side, just doesn't have the mental game to keep up with it. It's like, well, what have you been paying this guy for all these years? And then suddenly they put him in the car and they say, this guy's actually kind of good. Who knew, right? Who knew that this guy that we've been paid to drive our cars and has been the most promising guy to really come out of their rookie program and their, junior program in many a time, is actually pretty good at Formula 1 driving. So it's, this team is hilarious. That's all I'll say about Red Bull every single time this happens. But and then they're like, oh yeah, well actually this guy's pretty good. So they're putting him in the car. We'll see how he delivers. Of course, if he under-delivers, that helps out Sergio Perez and probably Liam Lawson too to some degree. But I think for Cadillac, just an interesting segue, they are looking at their drivers for 2026. They're probably looking at Colton Herta, young-ish American driver with some talent. Probably going to put it in the wall a few times, but exciting prospect. He makes a bit of sense. There's some other options too. But alongside him, you probably want an experienced head who can help you with development and these other things as well. Perez, Magnussen, Bottas, Ricciardo. I think Ricciardo's probably just done with F1, but those type of names have, of course, been thrown around. But I will say that Lawson's current predicament, and he's now out of the team entirely, is likely helpful for Perez in some regards, because all of a sudden Perez doesn't look quite as bad. And there's the other benefit to Perez, the massive commercial appeal that will come with that. And of course, it makes a fair bit of sense for Cadillac. So just keep an eye on that story, I would say. But let's move on to the whole Max Verstappen situation, right? Because some big developments here today, sparks as ever by Dr. Helmut Marko. Now, Raymond Vermeulen, who is the manager of Max, says this: the car itself is at the development ceiling, which is definitely concerning for Max if it's true. So Max is going to have to make the difference himself. It's going to be a very exciting season. Max is basically going to have to race hard, and he thinks he's going to enjoy it. Is he going to win though? Because at the end of the day, Max likes to win. He'd prefer to win by miles than win by a by a close margin, at least in the moment, because it's more enjoyable to win by miles, I imagine. But I guess it's more satisfying to win in a close margin if he can be able to do that. But the car may simply not be good enough. Today, a very interesting article comes out from Racing News 365 based on what Helmut Marko said to, I think it's the German press, well, Formel1.de. He says the following: upgrades are needed to help Max win his 5th world title. That's our big goal, and the whole team is working hard on it. Of course, every top driver has an exit clause if the performance is not good, but they are all tuned differently. That is not an issue for the moment. So Marko just throws it out there, and he's like, yeah, Max has performance clauses. One would imagine those performance clauses are not like, oh, Max, if you're struggling, we're going to get rid of you. It's like, that ain't happening, right? So Max is very much safe on that regard. But there will be clauses the other way around, when if the car isn't good enough, Max's contract that runs until the end of 2028 may be able to be rescinded, as it were. Now, there was a rumour last year that if Marko departed the team, if he quit, if he left the organisation, it activated a clause that also allowed Max to leave as well. That was a rumour. That may be true. It may not be true. There was then another rumour that in the whole civil war, Horner basically made Marko remove that clause, and now it's back to normal again. But it does seem a clause still exists that allows Max to leave if the right circumstances apply, and Marko is just saying this to the media, right? Like, he's putting the pressure on his own team absolutely in this moment. So says, yeah, if the car isn't good enough. Now, how that clause will be determined, who knows? Because, like Perez last year, the rumour was if he was within if he was outside of 100 points from Max at the summer break, then they could get rid of him if they wanted to for free. Like, it was just a clause they could activate. He actually was, I think, outside of that, but they decided to keep him around anyway. But this, is a rumour in terms of what that performance clause looks like. Is it depending on where Red Bull are in the constructors compared to the leaders, or is it dependent on performance of Max's teammate? Like, who knows really what that clause looks like. But presumably, if Red Bull continue to struggle, that performance clause may well be met by the summer break. And Marko was asked the question, okay, like, is it about the summer break? Because that's how it's been for Red Bull contract clauses in the past. And Marko says, yeah, that is the time window. But please, we're second in the drivers. We're 8 points behind Lando. The summer break is a long way away. And then Marko also was asked, well, if Max leaves, are you going to leave as well? And he says, that would be a good reason. Yeah, sure. So look at this guy, man. I mean, he loves talking to the media. He loves stirring the pot. And I can't imagine that Christian Horner reads these things and is like, oh my God, he's at it again, right? Like, he's at it again, leaking all of our internal stuff. And Marko basically saying, I think Marko knows what he's doing. He's putting the pressure on the team. He's saying, look, Max is going to leave at the mid-season break if you guys don't deliver good upgrades over the next 2 rounds, right? He's putting the pressure on the team, and he also says that I'm going to leave too. And, where could that be to? Obviously, we know that Jos Verstappen, Max Verstappen, Helmut Marko are all kind of, buddies, as it were. And that, of course, has raised questions about Mercedes. Now, there's a big thing to note here that Imola, there will be an upgrade package for the RB21. Could be a bumpy ride until then, is being described. So, yeah, time will tell whether this works or not. Because was it last year or whatever it was in Hungary, they brought a big upgrade which actually didn't really work. So it's not like Red Bull have got everything nailed down in terms of their upgrades plan. And they've talked a lot about the correlation issues that they still might be struggling with, right? So, time will tell whether this actually works. Then, of course, there's the Spanish Grand Prix where the flexible wing changes come into effect, which, maybe Red Bull believe will help them more than others. So it's not over yet. Max will always keep himself somewhere in the fight. And, as it stands, Max is 8 points behind Norris, 1 point ahead of Russell, 2 points ahead of Piastri in the world drivers' standings. that, if things go the way that they did in China, then Max is going to have a difficult time over the next few rounds maintaining a respectable gap here to the lead. And it is a very long season. But if the car isn't good by the summer break, and if Max believes that the engine next year is not going to be as good as the Mercedes, it's almost a no-brainer to leave the team at that point, if the situation at Mercedes aligns. Because one of the key rumours in F1 right now is that next year Merc are going to have the best engine again as they did in 2014, and the engines are going to be very important in this new cycle of regulations, as they always are, but probably especially so given the aero changes are potentially going to restrict innovation to some degree on that side. So the engine power is going to be drastically important. Rumour has it that Ferrari are looking not so good, at least compared to Mercedes right now, and the same is also likely true for Red Bull powertrains, who apparently are also pushing hard for the switch back to V10s. So if you're looking at Mercedes power, you no longer have Aston Martin, they are now Honda, but you have Alpine, you have Williams, you have McLaren, of course, but I think they're pretty happy with their drivers, and then you have Mercedes. Now, Toto says that Russell is absolutely one of the top 3 drivers in the sport. Presumably, he's probably talking about Lewis, Max, and George. Like, I'd imagine that he's giving, maybe he doesn't think that way. Maybe he thinks someone else is better than Hamilton. Maybe that's absolutely arguable. But I think probably Toto's still talking about Hamilton in here. And on his day, I think there's no doubt what Hamilton is still capable of. But he puts Russell in the conversation. Of course, though, if he had to, is he putting Russell number 1? No. Who's he putting number 1? Max Verstappen. So if you had to make the call, what are you going to do? Toto's been talking a lot lately about the driver contracts and is saying, yeah, we're having discussions. It's going to happen at some point. We definitely want to keep our drivers for the longer term. The contract is more than just giving them a car. There are other things as well to consider. We've got George taking pictures or getting photographed with the likes of Flavio Briatore, of Alpine, potentially to try and drive his market price up. Antonelli is not going anywhere, in my opinion. Like, he's the guy that Mercedes have tried to bring up to this team for years, and he's delivered, I think, so far in spades, mostly. Russell's been excellent, though, this year. Like, genuinely excellent. But is he Max Verstappen? Not quite. And if the opportunity was there, surely it's something that Toto would have a very difficult time refusing. So I would be surprised if in the next couple of months we get the confirmation Russell signed a 2-year extension. I kind of doubt it. It may happen, but what's probably more likely is that Toto will leave this one out. He'll let it ride out until the summer break. See what happens with Max Verstappen and this contract clause, which has now been made public knowledge thanks to Mr. Helmut Marko, Dr. Helmut Marko technically, and then a decision may or may not be made. So very much intrigued to your thoughts on all of this stuff in the comment section below as always. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.